Yo, friend, editing 360 footage is intimidating. It's just gotten a whole lot easier. I've changed the process of how I use this footage in my finished films here on YouTube. And I wanted to walk you through the 3 or 4 main different ways that you can accomplish this, and also talk through my favorite way to do it currently. So I'm going to try not leave out any step. And right now, when I use 360 footage in my films, what I'm often doing is actually using Insta360's built tools. I'm not trying to make the camera movements themselves be what's special. I'm trying to have the shot just be usable, nice, and not distracting. So I'm not going for a flashy editing style here. I'm going for one that is a subtle framing of the actual subject matter I want. I'm essentially trying to use it like a GoPro with all the advantages of a 360 camera that can film in all angles and be wide, and the invisible selfie stick. So there's going to be 3 methods that I walk through in this video of the various ways that you can use this footage, from the most advanced to the most straightforward and the most exciting. We're going to start with the most exciting and new, which is using the phone gyroscope. Then we're going to talk about the method that I use the most frequently, which is actually the Insta360 Studio app to track subject matter and do keyframes. And then we're going to talk about the process of exporting flattened 360 footage and then bringing that into your editor of choice and using Premiere with GoPro's plugin or right inside of Final Cut. And then we'll also talk about some color grading and things like that. It's going to be packed. You can go to the timestamps and also add your questions down below for future things that you want me to reference, so I can actually update the description of different questions that you may have. And you can see where the export settings and different things are. But also I put all of it into a PDF, which you can just grab in the description. Okay, so if you would have told me several years ago that I was going to actually be editing my Insta360 footage with the phone, I would have laughed at you, because that is not the best way to do it. That's not the best quality, and that's not the best customized control like what you can get with a computer. But there's a specific thing you can do with the phone with the gyroscope that gets a feeling of shot that if I was trying to replicate that on the computer, it would actually take me all day. And that is one that has a floating camera look with natural feeling pans to reframe. So you have options in the desktop editing that we're going to walk through, where you can track subject matter, where you can direction lock and do keyframes, but none of those options allow you to do a mixture of all of them and actually have natural feeling pans. So if we go into the app here and we actually load up a shot, you've got these headings above, and you've got quick and pro mode. Those are the ones I want to focus on today. And in quick mode, you can now record your gyroscopic inputs while you replay the footage. Okay, let's go through how to edit step by step with the phone. So you can connect to your camera. You need the clips on the SD card in the camera. Connect to it, go to the album, select the clip you want to edit, and you've now got this mode called quick. So you can zoom in and out with the joystick on the left side, and then the joystick in the center, you can pan left and right. But the whole time, once you hit record in the bottom, it's taking your inputs from the accelerometer of your phone and mapping that as camera moves. So wherever you look, that will pan and change the camera movement, which is honestly really fun. Feels like something that, you know, they would do, Mike Cameron would do on Avatar or something like that. Mike Cameron, is that his name? James Cameron. This makes me feel like James Cameron. Anyhow, so you basically can turn around and do any kind of panning. And what I like about this, currently I'm showing you it in the vertical format, but as we go through the shot here, you'll see a section where, sure, I could just have tracked me as the subject matter, and that's honestly what I'd normally do. But in this instance, I actually want to pan away from me and pan to my buddy John, who's snowboarding next to me. So here the camera's panned at me, but then I want to bias the camera and pan over and show John skiing. And this is where, if I wanted to keyframe that movement, that would actually take a little bit of time. And so be able to just automatically do that by holding my phone and pointing it there is pretty rad. Here's another example where, hey, we can look at John skiing, and then we can pan back to me. Oh man, snowboarding is just so much fun. This is kind of a really neat way to manipulate this footage in a way that I haven't been able to before. And where this becomes really obvious how powerful it is that if you do a sport where, let's say you're doing a head mount or a chest mount and you're biking, you don't actually have an obvious subject matter in the frame. If you're doing a point of view chest cam shot, you don't have an obvious thing in the frame that you can select and track. that's a problem because that means you have to manually put keyframes in every single angle change. So this is where the gyroscope editing really just unlocks a faster way to do a specific style of shot. And it ends up, in my opinion, looking even better than if you keyframed it, because if you keyframe it, it kind of has a not natural feeling look. But if you do it with just gyroscope, it ends up feeling more like a cable cam, and that you're floating down in the center with doing these slight reframes, because as the bike actually changes its angles, if you weren't in the gyroscope mode, the camera would actually pan away and your angle would be ruined. But because you're recording your camera inputs with your phone, you can keep what you want framed in the center subtly in nice, smooth handheld movement. And then you're good to go. You can just have an awesome shot of your bike tearing down the woods through the forest. So to export your clips, you can hit export in the top right. It brings up some settings. You can choose trimmed or full video. We're going to go trimmed because it's a massive video. And you want to crank the resolution for the camera that you shot with. So this was X4, we can go 4K. And for bitrate, 50 megabits per second. And then the frame rate, whatever you shot it in, the max frame rate. Okay, let me walk you through my main workflow. 90% of the time in the Insta360 Studio app, it will ask you to automatically import if you have a card connected. I would never do this because you're editing the footage from the micro SD card. So do not do it this way. I prefer to import the footage in Finder separately and then import it yourself. So close that box, go to where you imported the footage on your hard drive. It will always be faster to edit from here. I'm going to show you some example clips from snowboarding and just drag them all in. You technically don't need to drag the preview file, but that's fine. The INSV is the actual recorded 360 video from Insta360. Here, the clip is loaded up. You can drag around in the viewer. You can zoom in and out. There's some controls down here on the right to change the framing size. So if you want to do something in vertical instead of horizontal, I'm almost always working in horizontal. You can turn guides on and off. So I have a grid turned on. Let's zoom forward till a section. And most of the time, I'm just trying to get a usable shot out of a moment like this. So I will start by setting a frame size that I like. If you want to custom tune the exact number, you can hit the add keyframe button and it will show you the exact parameters. And I'm usually between somewhere in the 55 range to 85. I don't go much wider than 85 because then it gets pretty warpy, and the corners you can really start to see the resolution turns quite soft. And then the problem with going too zoomed in is that, again, you get more softness issues because there's not tons of resolution to work with. So I find somewhere in this 55 to 85 range usually gets me what I'm looking for. If it's action, I'm usually going wider. So there we set a keyframe so we could just see those controls. We'll talk about keyframing more in a moment. But what I'm normally doing is using the deep track mode right here. Selecting my subject, you can use the automated, that little white box. If you click that, it will auto select the subject. I like just dragging a box, and then I hit start tracking. And this will just track forward entirely and keep me in the center. And it often does a really good job unless you have stuff cross the frame. So if you do a big slash of powder and it comes up, it will sometimes cause the camera to freak out. But if it does stop tracking, all you have to do, if it stops tracking, it will look like that. It'll just say error. You can zoom in, get the playhead right near where the last one stopped, and just start your next one after it. And it usually does a decent job blending between the two. And if it doesn't, you can trim the handles a little bit so it behaves more like a keyframe transition. But this is what I'm doing most of the time, because if we're being honest, lots of the times that I'm using these cameras is simply just to show a GoPro style perspective of me doing a sport. So I will often track through almost the entirety of a clip. We're jumping around here just to show different portions and what the tracking mode is capable of. But this gets me the results that I like. The downside of using the tracking mode like this is that you don't get fine-tuned control over changing parameters to make camera movements. So if you wanted to do a wider shot that slowly got tighter, or the reverse of that, you can't actually animate much parameters. You're just kind of left with this tracked area, which shows up in yellow, which you then can change the field of view, but you can't actually, you can change distortion amount. What do they call this? Yeah, distortion control. You can change distortion control slightly, but you can't actually move the camera once you've got this yellow bar, which says this is a tracked area. So this is what tracked footage looks like. And I will often trim handles on it by pressing Command K or simply dragging these things in because I don't need the full clip. And for the effects, I will often use Motion ND. So to see your visual effects, you've got some controls down here on the top right. And if you go down to media processing, you can see the Motion ND setting. I always bring this down to around 30 and 30, somewhere in that range. So the spread changes the circle size of how far in motion blur is occurring, and intensity is obviously how intense it is. And this will add some blur to the corners to simulate the speed that was actually there when you were doing it. Because the camera records in such a high shutter speed, you don't see motion blur that you'd see in a properly recorded image because you can't put ND filters on these cameras. Motion ND is fine. It's way better to have it in the software than not have it, and I will use it often. My preferred method is to use an alternative plugin that costs quite a bit of money actually in my editing software. That's Real Steady Motion Blur. I'll talk about that when we get to editing in the software. These settings here, Clarity Plus and Color Plus, I really don't find them to do stuff that I can't easily do in my editor. So if you turn these effects on and you like the way they look, then that's fine. You can just bake those right in to the file at this step. For me personally, I would prefer to do this on my own in my editor. That was the tracking mode. Let's talk about keyframes. So you can add a keyframe by clicking that button or pressing Command K, and then you can change your parameters. Let's do an exaggerated move here to just show you what keyframes do. So there's a keyframe set. And if we move forward on the timeline, we can set another one. And let's make this now a lot wider and more normal roll. So if we go to the start of this now and play this through, you can see it animates that movement. The problem with this mode is that you need to go through and keep adding keyframes to make sure your camera's framed with where you want. So I do that by hitting play forward with the space bar, constantly dragging at semi-regular intervals to bring the framing back center. And so then when you go and play that whole thing back through, instead of the camera slowly shifting, it actually keeps the subject matter in the center. Because if you select all these keyframes and deleted them and we just played this through, it doesn't take very long for our framing to have the subject matter leave, especially if the subject matter is going around corners and things like that. So this is where keyframing can become very, very tedious. So to export this, click on the export button. And then the hierarchy I choose here is for the resolution, I'll use the highest reframed resolution size for that camera. So for the X3, that's 1920. For the X4, it's 3840, depending on the shooting mode that you filmed in. You can create presets of these settings. I usually just kind of glance it and set it as it goes. If you shot in a higher frame rate, it will give you the option to lower that frame rate. I would always select the highest frame rate that the clip was shot in. So here that's 24 frames per second, and it's just one option, grayed out. Encoding format, I do H.265 because that's the most efficient. If your computer can't handle that, stick to H.264. ProRes is just ridiculous. It's such a large file size and the quality improvement is not noticeable. I wouldn't bother with ProRes. We're going to use H.265. So for bitrate, for reframe shots, I'm often somewhere around 50 to 120. It depends, but the maximum bitrate for an X3 is 120 megabits per second. So over anything around 120 to 60, we're going to be getting the max bitrate that the camera even recorded in anyways. Like I've done some small tests of just cranking this up. I'm not seeing a massive difference. So I'm just going to be realistic here and go somewhere around 100. And then for the storage location, I like storing it right beside where the originals were. So if we go to the folder where I've been referencing this footage from, we've been working out of this folder here. So this is my camera card right here. This is where the originals are. In this folder, I will create something called reframes and export it to there. If I'm doing flattened 360 clips, I will also create a folder called flatten 360. And we'll talk about that process next. So reframes go here. Hit either add to queue if you're ready to do more and want to just batch them all at once, or just start export immediately. And then you can see it go through export history there. Here's an example of a shot that I had to do keyframes out of necessity because the tracking mode just could not keep up with the camera movement. So as we play it back here, it's just a big sweeping, fast 360 move. This was edited in vertical. So we're going to just delete these keyframes here so I can show you what it looks like for me to do this. Go to the start of the clip area, drag around, frame the subject in the center, Command K to add a keyframe right there. Again, you can change the parameters if you want to, but we're just going to hit play, drag again in a little bit, Command K, and continue this process throughout the clip. You don't need to do these keyframes so close together, but you want any big movement changes that are linear between them to add them. If it's like, if there's multiple movement directions in a section, you need to add a keyframe for each of those new movements, if that makes sense. You just go through like this, drag the box around, wipe. And this is where you can see it does take quite a while if you're going to do each individual shot with this method. And this method's honestly pretty similar if you have the clips inside your editor of choice anyways. And so now if we play this through, you can see it tracks the subject matter smoothly. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of control over how the keyframes behave in relation to each other. And also, when you change between the frame sizes, it doesn't do a good job of understanding what width you'd want for that different format. So this is the big bummer of, I want them to figure out how to do this better, because it would be really nice if it would auto adjust the frame size. But instead you actually have to manually go in and change the frame size of your keyframes. So if you go down and click at the space in between the keyframes, you get controls over how they behave. I don't find any of these to be natural feeling or intuitive. And unfortunately, it doesn't give you handles or beziers to manually adjust how the keyframes slide between each other, which is a bummer. So that's the kind of finesse control you can get if you don't use the Studio app. Hopefully this is some stuff that they'll add in the future. You can see over on this section of the timeline, I actually have a mixture of tracked subject matter and keyframes. If you're going to mix them together, you actually want to leave a bit more of a gap between the two, and Insta360 will auto transition between your last keyframe and the start of the new tracked section. Let's do a refresher on what my old process used to be. This is also the way that gets you the most finessed control in your editor. So if you want to be able to reframe to music or do 3D tracking or basically anything advanced, this is the method you're most likely going to want to do. So you need to turn the files that came off the memory card into usable files in your editor. So just select them all, hit export again, go to export 360 video instead of reframed. And these parameters here, you do the original resolution that it was shot in, so the highest resolution possible. Bitrate recommended often gets you the highest bitrate that's possible from that camera, or you can go custom. So because we shot this on the X3, the highest bitrate possible would be 120. So you can match that. You can go over if you're worried some bits will be lost in the transcoding process. There's not a huge advantage to doing that, but you can do that. Again, I'm going to do H.265 because my computer can handle it. If it can't, go to H.264. And for these settings here, I never use the remove grain because it just takes forever, and I don't find it to be that. I don't really like the way it does it. If I'm going to remove grain, I'll do it with Neat Video, different external tool. Apply direction lock. If you're filming from a selfie stick, you don't want to use this. If you're filming from a mounted location, you do want to use this. So if you have the camera mounted to a truck or some type of physical object, using direction lock is very helpful. Flow state stabilization on, and then start export and change the location. Again, I put it in a flattened 360 folder, and you can see what that looks like. To bring this into your editor, you want to find your flattened footage, select it, import it. On Final Cut, if you change the option key, it will change if it's going to copy and paste or if it's going to link the file in its location. We're going to link the file in its location. And you can see that it's 360 video because of this icon in the corner. If you aren't getting that icon, or if your files aren't behaving properly, you often need to change the metadata of the file to tell your editing software that this is a 360 clip that you're dealing with. We're going to create then just a normal timeline. So we're going to do that in 4K 30 frames per second because that's the end result of what this footage was shot in. We're going to change this to just reframing selects. Often I will go through and try to find my 360 selects in one sequence so that way I can reference them later. And then we're going to take some clips and drop them down into the timeline. And you can see now over in the viewer that we've got 360 video. So you can make your window a little bigger here. And if we go down now, we have tools for actually reframing this footage directly on the timeline. So you can right click the orientation, change it to the orientation tool. And now you can drag and click around to reframe and pan. This can be a little janky. Reframe and pan your camera movements. Now, if you want to animate these, this is where you come over to the settings area. You want to go down to orientation. And one of the first things we want to do is actually change the mapping mode from normal to tiny planet. If we leave it on normal, when you zoom out, you get weird framing edges and it doesn't look normal. So you can't go fully wide. So we want to go to tiny planet and then zoom it in. Oftentimes I'm selecting a field of view somewhere in the neighborhood of, I can sometimes go as close as 80 degrees field of view, but 150 to 180 is pretty reasonable if we're doing a wide shot. And then down the right side, you want to select all these keyframe icons. And that means it's going to track our inputs every time we make a change in the viewer. And if we go show video animation, it will actually show us those keyframes as they pop up. Now, the disadvantage inside of Final Cut is that it does not give us fine-tuned control over those keyframes. Final Cut has some of the worst keyframe control of any editor, unfortunately. So you just have to deal with it. I like turning on custom overlay so that way we can actually see a sense of what our framing is turning out as. And now, as we drag around, you can see new keyframes get added to the new point. So if we play ahead a little bit and then drag around on the viewer, it will add a new keyframe to that spot. So this is another method of working with this footage, and it is tedious. This is not my favorite way to do it, but it's certainly a method that you can use. And if you like doing custom movements to music where you want the actual camera pans and stuff to be in relationship with each other, this is probably the better way to do it. Before we talk about color grading and some of the other effects, let's address the most powerful way to work with this footage is actually a way that I never do, and that is inside of Premiere using GoPro's VR plugin. So GoPro ironically has the best tool. It's called GoPro FX Reframe, and it works with any 360 flattened video. So ironically, the best tool for editing Insta360 footage in Premiere and getting the most customized control is actually with GoPro's plugin. I personally don't use this, but Abe Kitzlevitz has an awesome walkthrough tutorial showing the ins and outs of using this plugin. If you're in Premiere, this is probably the best way that I would do it, and go over and watch this video for a much better in-depth walkthrough of how to utilize this plugin inside of Premiere. Okay, let's talk through color grading and some of the special effects or editing techniques I'll use on this footage. So here's an example of a shot where I did some masking. There's another one right here. And then another shot that was special in this sequence is this slow motion shot right here. This one, I put this through Topaz AI to generate and interpolate some more frames. That way it could be slowed down some more. If I'm going to do any masking or 3D tracking, I will do that in After Effects. So I'll take the reframed clip, bring it into After Effects, do a 3D camera track, and then from there, I'll do masking and cutting out holes in the image. That way you can do some of those transitions. This takes me forever. I'm not fast at it. I'm not quick. I'm also not the best to teach it. My friend Will did an amazing tutorial on this topic. I'll link it below. That's definitely what I'd watch instead of me trying to explain it. But what I am willing to explain is my color workflow. So my theory with these cameras is to try to get the best images in camera as possible. specifically because they're 8-bit. So if I have these reframe shots that I'm going to use in my edits, what I want to do is have them sort of match my A camera and not stress it too much. So to spice these images up and have them look a little better, this is kind of my workflow for that. So the main plugin that I use on clips like this is something called Real Steady Motion Blur. So if you go through this clip, all these palm trees flying by don't really have any motion blur whatsoever. So first we're going to make the shot fill the canvas we're working on here, the timeline. I edit in 2:1 aspect ratio most of the time for YouTube. So let's go down, find Real Steady Motion Blur. It's an expensive plugin, but it's worth it. And when you put it on, you will notice that as we get to something that has motion, let it render here, it will show some blur. And sometimes this blur can look quite realistic, and other times it can look a little bit sketchy. So I go over and I finesse and change these amounts. You can use the pro version of the plugin and do some fancy masking. I just tend to use the normal version of the plugin and change the blur sensitivity and amount. So now as we pass objects, they actually have some motion. So let's go here and we'll do a time remap. So this is something that I'm doing very often. Drag a range here, bring up your time controls and set them to like 2000%, and then it'll whoosh, go right through. You can see as we play this back, it just has a much better aesthetic to it, especially with the motion blur added. Now let's talk about color grading. So I will add sharpening. Oops, I just added this on as a track. Let's add it actually to the clip. And I usually end up somewhere between 1 and 1.5. You can use your own discretion to decide on the amount that you like, depending on what you shot in camera. Sometimes I use medium sharpness, sometimes I use low. And then we add some color tabs here. And then when we go back over to our main window here, we want to look at them stacked up, and we want color board at the top, color wheels beneath that, and curves right underneath color board. The reason for that is that they behave in the order that they're listed. And I use color board. Let's get some scopes up here so we can see our black point at the bottom where it's clipping and the highlight clipping point. I use the color board primarily for exposure adjustment. So you can change the whole shot here and then pull around the shadows and the highlights. So typically I'll do some amount of exposure adjustments to a shot if I feel it needs a little bit of touching up. And then when we go over to color, this is a space where if you wanted to shift the whole shot in a specific direction, you could easily do that here as well. So if you wanted the shadows to have a little bit more blues in them, you could lift those a tiny bit. You could also just take the whole shot and make it more warm. But I actually usually leave the colors pretty similar, but what I do is try to match it to the film look that I shoot on my main Sony camera. So by doing that, I just lift the greens and the blues a tiny bit to make them a little more dominant. And then over here on the Luma curve, I lift the shadows just a smidge to soften it out a tiny bit to hopefully have it match my main camera aesthetic better. That's the most of what I do. And then if I need to do a white balance adjustment, I go over to the color wheels and do a temperature adjustment from there. It's kind of the basics of what I do color-wise. You really can't push these images. So if it doesn't look good out of camera, you're going to be hard-pressed to get an aesthetic that you like. And anything you do aggressive, it's just 8-bit. It's just going to fall apart. So that's kind of my color grading process. The one main area that we haven't talked about almost at all is my audio process. And audio is such a key part of making 360 footage feel really cohesive in your pieces. And usually what I'm doing here is sound design by using other recorded audio from the same trip. So I will very rarely use the audio recorded in the camera, mainly because often I'm in a windy environment and putting on the wind puffy stickers on the 360 camera, often they will fall off, or if I'm putting it in and out of a water housing, it doesn't work. So what I normally do is I have a recorder and a lav mic with me, and I just record audio when I'm using 360, and then I manually line it up or use syncing tools. So I don't use the mic port on the camera. I don't use wireless audio. I don't do any of that. And I mean, there's different ways that you can sync your audio using built-in tools. Usually I will try to start my 360 clips if I'm using audio in a recorder and actually say something loud to the 360 camera so there's an obvious sync point. But it's not very glamorous, and that's what it often looks like. I will have a lav mic into a pocket recorder. I use the tentacle sync in 32-bit float. So that way if something exciting happens and I yell, it actually doesn't clip the audio. So the audio process is not glamorous. It's often just manually syncing, but that's the more reliable way than using wireless transmitters, because getting a microphone cable plugged into the X4, I've not found to be very reliable. And then it also removes the ability to have it be waterproof. That's my breakdown of how I use this footage. I'm sure there's some obvious things that you wish that I addressed, and I'd love to hear them in the comments, and we can try to update it here or just add information where I can. And also, if there's other topics that you want me to dive into, I want to do more technical breakdowns and actually make stuff that's helpful for you. So this is a resource I want to do for Adventure Film Academy. I want to give back to the community and try to make stuff that's helpful. So that's it for this one. Thanks so much for watching. And remember, life's better when you make stuff. Peace.